We have seen a series of headlines over the last few years where organizations introduced biometrics in retail stores such as supermarkets and shopping malls. And some use cases have been for time and attendance of their employees, for payments, or also to stop shoplifting. We know biometrics are convenient and they are really good at recognizing people. And like any security technology, though, they bear risks and weaknesses. And these need to be addressed, but they can be mitigated against. But there's a lot you have to consider when you introduce biometrics. And when things go wrong, it's not always the fault of the technology, but rather the process that has failed. And many of these challenges that apply to retailers also apply elsewhere when biometrics are used in public spaces, especially by private businesses. In this On the Pulse conversation, we're focusing on retail, and we're going to discuss how biometrics are used in retail, what the benefits are, what some common fears are, and also what retailers should consider when they are thinking about biometrics. So I'm joined here today by Brett Feldon, who is a former director of the Biometrics Institute and currently a member of our advisory council and head of our digital identity group. Hello, Brett.
Hello, very pleased to be here.
Fantastic. Well, let's start off this conversation with a very simple question, Brett. What are biometrics?
A simple question, but getting a complex answer. At the centre, you'd say it was recognition of humans using distinctive characteristics like the face. Mostly it's used to mean mechanisms that use computers. But of course, there are also circumstances where people do some of that work as well. When you start thinking more broadly, though, you add in uses like classification. So machines estimating or assessing approximate age or gender of participants or of subjects of video footage. And of course, it's not all about face. You also have biometrics like gait, like the voice, like fingerprints, consistently measurable behaviours and so on. So it turns out to be surprisingly tricky to draw clean boundaries around the term. But this is one of the places where the Institute's explanatory dictionary provides some guidance and assistance to people to help with that.
Yeah, I often hear people say, oh, it's really about my face or my fingerprint, maybe even the way I type. But it is quite complex, as you've just explained, and there's a lot to learn, and terminology is one of the challenges, isn't it? So let me ask you then, where are we seeing biometrics being used in a retail environment?
Yeah, it's pretty important that you think carefully through use cases. One of the themes, I suppose, through the history of the Institute and its members thinking through this is the idea that just because we can do something with biometrics, should we do that thing? Some of the use cases we see are things like identifying known people in physical places, physical locations, like say a shop, where that might be used to support loyalty rewards, supporting important customers or valued customers, or perhaps to detect people who we believe are suspected of prior shoplifting. We also see biometrics used in that estimation usage that I spoke about earlier, estimating age or gender perhaps, used to target advertising. That might be used in, say, a shopping mall space or something like that. But we also see biometrics used in things like, say, frictionless payments. We're seeing in the US, for instance, stores using palm vein detection for payments. And the consequence of that is that the person paying has no requirement to carry particular objects like a credit card with them, no digital devices like a phone with them. Instead, their person, their physical body enables them to pay. So you think about use cases like a surfer wanting to go and pay for a coffee and the level of convenience that was otherwise not achievable.
Yeah, I like the idea of the surfer. Just, I grab my surfboard and I go to the beach, and there's nothing I need to carry, no mobile phone to worry about. Where will I leave it on that beach? And guess what? Afterwards, I just walk into the coffee shop and get my coffee. I mean, that sounds like such a convenient solution, but also quite safe, of course. So yeah, amazing, really, what you can do. So who can benefit from the use of biometrics? Let's talk a bit more about that.
Sure. And in theory, many different kinds of organizations, of government agencies, many different ways and places. I think if you were to look through the use cases that the Institute sees through its membership and the ways people think about those and the benefits, you'd see some consistent themes arising along a couple of different lines. One of those is the business benefit. It takes work to implement biometrics. And so people need to think through, is there enough organizational value to justify that work that it gets undertaken? Some organizations don't think through the consequences of implementing biometrics and the amount of work that's required. And so sometimes the real costs can be greater than what you think. So it's thinking through those issues in advance just to make sure the business benefit is good is important. But the other side of that coin is the consumer benefit, the customer benefit. So is there enough, right? Does the customer benefit enough? Do the users, the people subjected to the system, get enough out of what that system to justify what they're subjected to? Will they see benefit from it? Are you able to, through that benefit stream, address reasonable concerns around privacy and protection of data and protection of information? So those two different streams are important to consider when thinking through where benefit can be delivered.
There's a lot to think about, clearly. So it doesn't, at first glance, it doesn't seem that complex. And I mean, can you give an example to just give us a better idea what that could look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about that consumer side, for instance, of what the benefit stream looks like, and thinking about retail in particular, if you think about a use case like payments, for instance, that we spoke about earlier, some of the issues around determining whether there's a good consumer benefit stream are less complex and less controversial because of the voluntary use nature, right? So
Mm.
you're not if you're not mandated to use the service, then it's much easier to make those determinations around where those benefit streams lie, because you're not asking every single person, every single potential customer to be subjected to the system. But if you think about some of those other use cases we spoke about, continuous monitoring of a space, for instance, to establish whether there are people we don't want in that space, then every potential customer in that physical space is subjected to the system in some manner. So you need to think a lot more carefully through the benefit stream associated with that in order to make sure that those benefits outweigh those customers being subjected to that.
Mm.
This obviously leads to a question, right? How do I decide whether I should use biometrics or not?
Yeah, that is a great question. And as you said, just because you can doesn't mean you should use biometrics. Yeah, it might not always be the right choice. But yeah, how do you work that out? Well, the good news is there is plenty of guidance around and available, not only from the Biometrics Institute, from other organizations too, but of course the Institute itself developed a good practice framework to help people think through these issues and give themselves basically the best shot at success in using biometrics, to think about the potential consequences of the choices you make in that particular use case. And as you outlined earlier, Brett, of course, there is convenience that biometrics can offer in a retail environment to the consumer. It can save costs to the retailer and increase security to both parties. So, it's potentially a very good solution. And there's definitely a place for biometrics, but there are concerns as well, especially over privacy. And we see a lot of that in the headlines that I mentioned earlier on. So let's talk more about that, Brett. What are people's fears around biometrics?
Let's start with one that's been in the press a bit and has been covered in some of those articles you spoke about, the issue of bias, as it's usually called when it's discussed in the media. And this is the notion different biometrics sometimes perform differently when used for different purposes or in different scenarios. So a concrete example, a particular biometric system might be better at distinguishing Kenyan people than Japanese people in that scenario, as an example. And there's an obvious question. So if that is true, what do we do about it? There are lots of different actions that can be taken, but one of the key ones is selecting the right type of biometrics. That's both the mode, face versus fingerprint and so on, but also the technology and establishing that that's the right thing for that particular purpose and scenario. And getting those things right is absolutely critical.
Yeah, well, humans are biased too, and we're not always that good at recognizing people either. So, that there's quite a lot of research into that, in fact, that is looking at the comparison between the human and the machine and how well they perform. So the good news, of course, once again, is around this particular issue. There are standards, international standards that have been developed, and there is testing available for biometrics that address a lot of the risks or the challenges around biometrics. And they also address this so-called bias, which the experts really refer to as demographic differentials.
Yeah, and understanding those demographic differentials, understanding the limitations of the automated system or systems that you're using is key, because if you understand those limitations, you can design and you can manage those limitations with human oversight. So it's pretty important to understand what those look like in order to design an overall outcome that delivers good value. It's also worth considering the intersection when biometrics are used alongside other, especially AI detection tools, because sometimes there are interactions there that need to be considered when you're building these systems. And worth noting in that regard too is the potential to entrench past human biases should be thought about and should be designed out of any such systems. It's obviously a complex subject, but just worth mentioning.
Of course, that reminds me of the 3 laws of biometrics, which we devised with our members. And they really stress that, you need to think about the policy first. You shouldn't just be guided by the technology. That is, of course, important, but you have to think about the policy in the very first instance, and then also decide what is the process. So they are questions about, engaging with the stakeholders. It's questions around putting safeguards and controls in place, conducting audits. And then, of course, think about technology. So in that order of policy first, process second, and technology third, knowing your algorithm, knowing your data, knowing your operational environment. It's really such a great, simple guide to remind organizations there's a lot to consider, a lot more to consider than just the technology to ensure a successful implementation.
Absolutely. Absolutely true. The other thing I'd mention just on that is the idea of misidentification. And you talked earlier about human bias. Machines are capable of misidentification just as humans are, right? And bias that we spoke about earlier is really about groups of people for whom that is more of an issue, for whom more mistakes are made, more misidentifications are made. Although that's a little bit of an oversimplification, it's good enough for this purpose. The other thing I'd say is, again, that's linked to understanding the limitations of the technology and designing appropriate oversight to mitigate that. Links back to your point, Isabelle, about the process and the importance of that and getting it right.
Yeah, misidentification is a huge concern, and again, that's made plenty of headlines in the retail environment. And in our annual industry survey, 81% of the respondents said that no biometric system should operate independently without human oversight, the so-called human in the loop. There is an output from the system, but there's got to be, certainly for certain use cases, a human that makes the final decision and puts things into context.
Yeah, that's an interesting result, I think. And certainly when used in very high impact scenarios like policing or choosing to apprehend a potential shoplifter in a store, I think you'd see pretty broad public agreement with that sentiment, having a human in the loop. But I think if you looked at higher volume, lower impact uses of biometrics, we talked earlier about payments, for instance, I'm not sure you'd see quite as widespread support for human in the loop in that circumstance.
Yeah, but also, of course, if I imagine I walk out of a shop with lots of bags and suddenly a security guard walks up to me as I'm about to exit the shop and says, well, you've got to follow me into this room. I mean, that would be quite intimidating, being then interrogated there and then. And suddenly during the conversation, someone advises, well, actually, it's not her. She just looked like someone on our system. I mean, that is quite different from when I try to pay contactless with my face or finger and the transaction doesn't go through. That is annoying and an inconvenience, but it's not really intimidating. So, that's a challenge. And how would a retail store actually manage this situation, this potential misidentification situation?
I think it's an elegant example, actually, of why the three laws exists, right? Because that starts from a policy decision about when you choose to use the tools in order to support things like this. It's underpinned and helped by the processes you design around it, designing the mechanism, whether you intervene. For instance, the way you use humans to review the images on which you're basing the identification process, and how that apprehension happens. Who does it? What's the nature of the conversation between the person who does it and the person in the store? And also, of course, the technology, planning carefully around that and getting appropriate advice to tune the systems to minimize these kinds of outcomes occurring. So it's an elegant little microcosm, I think, of the broader advice the Institute gives about the ways to think about these systems.
Yes, absolutely. So, Brett, we have talked a bit about now about bias and misidentification, but there are other fears. So let's talk about those. They are mostly related to privacy. And that's also why it's so important. Like we stress it again and again, don't we? That the three laws, we need to focus on the privacy protections and the implications there. So let's talk about those types of concerns a bit more, Brett. What can you think about?
Yeah, look, a key one that arises is the issue of data sharing, in which the key issue really is alignment with community expectations, which in turn needs, good quality, well executed, properly founded consultation processes. You think about, say, stores wanting to share data about potential shoplifters. If those two stores are of the same brand, for instance, and they're in the same city or the same part of the same city, it might be considered by the community okay that those two choose to share data of that kind of nature. But then if you thought about two stores of different brands on opposite sides of the country, the answer might be very different. It might not be within the community's expectations that that's a thing that would occur. So I just flagged that it's not always an identical answer. You need to think very carefully about the circumstances and align that with the consultation you do with the community. The other point is of course, there are links and circumstances of that nature to sharing with law enforcement agencies. We're talking about issues like potential shoplifters. And in turn, that, of course, links to what safeguards they have in place, both around the data and the quality of it and the storage of it and where that's used, but also the trust placed in the data that they're given. So the extent to which they rely heavily on the store's data and or conduct appropriate investigations. So there are lots of linkages there.
Yeah, the idea of losing control over my data, I certainly wouldn't like that thought. And it's very clear that to build trust, it's absolutely essential that a retailer would really look at being transparent about what they are doing, how they collect the data, how they store it, manage it, secure it, who they share it with, in as far as they can tell, and also whether they delete the data. So really understanding that process is very important. And the good practice framework that I mentioned earlier says very much at the beginning of where it sets out all these considerations around biometrics that meaningful stakeholder consultation is absolutely critical. And you've touched on that already, Brett. That has to happen really right at the start when you think about using biometrics. And we've also devised privacy guidelines that set out 18 principles and additional questions as well that take you through different scenarios and give you examples. What is proportionality? What is informed consent? What do you need to think about when you introduce biometrics in a retail environment?
I mean, thinking about that issue of privacy more generally, you're absolutely right. The alignment with community expectations is absolutely key there. And of course, the intersection with privacy law in the location in which you're operating. But that community expectations piece, what is reasonably expected in one nation or even in one community may not be in another. So it is absolutely not a one size fits all, you can give international advice. It's just not the case. It's also worth mentioning that the relationship between machine-performed and human-performed surveillance for similar kinds of purposes is interesting to compare and also confounding to compare. But it's worth just flagging that because that does intersect with this subject because you do have humans doing some parts of the work sometimes. On that point about consent, of course, alignment with the law is critical. But in some cases, it's not completely clear cut. I mean, one example of that is what constitutes reasonable notice, for instance, of the use of such technologies. That can vary quite dramatically or not be stated very clearly in some circumstances. And so our view would be that community engagement about the reasonableness of the approach that you're planning is recommended. And as you pointed out, Isabelle, there has to be meaningful communication or engagement with those stakeholders. I'd also flag just on consent the point that as the economic scale of an entity expands, the potential impact on people who don't want to consent is compounded. And that fact should be contemplated as part of that community engagement. I mean, if you think, for instance, about, say, a dominant supermarket chain in a particular country choosing to engage with this field, if you practically have no other option to buy your groceries, that's obviously a very substantial impact on some portions of the population if they don't wish to be subjected to these technologies.
Yeah, and we talked about this many times. Consent is really tricky, isn't it? Like you say, different people have very different views of the world. I mean, it's a different environment, but I traveled through an airport recently, and once I got to the conveyor belt, I could see I was waiting for my suitcase. I wasn't doing very much, and suddenly I saw there's a big sign on top saying CCTV in operation. I mean, I couldn't miss that sign. Plus, also, I already know from having learned over time that in an airport, there's a very good reason why there is CCTV in operation. And so I feel quite comfortable with it because I'm educated and the signage is clear and I'm focused. I'm not distracted. So, I mean, there are things certainly to learn from other sectors and what they have done.
In similar vein, I was struck recently by seeing a similar sort of sign advertising the use of cameras in a particular area that actually rather boldly proclaimed we don't use biometrics in that scenario. So a very different perspective in that particular circumstance.
Yeah, it's one of those really sensitive issues. And as we said, the only way to manage that is to consult with the people who will be impacted by the use and gain a good understanding what their response is. I mean, too often the headlines seem to give you this perspective that people turned up in a shop or at their workplace and suddenly there was some form of use of biometrics. Whether that's really true, we don't know, but that's the reporting we are seeing, and that is certainly a concern. That could be fixed relatively easily, but it will mean resources and time to conduct those consultations to seek proper consent and what that means. So we've talked about the benefits now quite a bit, Brett, in that retail environment, and of course the concerns too. The big question left unanswered so far is, so what are some recommended first steps that retailers should take when they consider using biometrics?
Well, it's perhaps an obvious answer, but talk to the Biometrics Institute. With 23 years experience, the Institute is a great way to get educated and to make sure that you get the outcomes you want from thinking about or using biometric technologies. So maybe you're working out whether to use biometrics in the first place. And in that case, engagement with the Institute and its membership will help you form a balanced perspective to answer those questions. Maybe you've decided to implement biometrics, but you want to be informed before you start engaging suppliers so that your shopping cart isn't filled with unpleasant surprises. Again, the Institute can be a good way to start testing ideas and then to start thinking about how you would go about that process. Hopefully, though, if you look to deploy biometrics in a retail context, your aim is to deliver an outcome with lasting value and in a responsible, ethical, and effective way so that it stands the test of time. That's certainly our mission, and we hope you share it.
Yeah, we have used the expression before, Brett. It's not speed dating. It's a long-term relationship that you form with your biometric implementation for sure. And you've been a member for a very long time, and it's understandable that you're passionate about this community. I always say this community is so willing to share the lessons they have learned because we provide this independent and trusted environment. Why wouldn't you want to tap into that knowledge and learn from those who've been there before? And as we said, many lessons that we have learned in a border environment, airports, etc., can be transferred. The issues, the concerns are often still the very same. And of course, we're bringing together such a diverse community. You really get that balanced view. It is government, it is suppliers, it's academics, it's privacy regulators, privacy advocates, and everyone has a voice. So it's a very rich perspective that you get on the world. So,
Absolutely.
Brett, thank you so much. I know we could talk a lot longer, but we'll leave it here because we've covered the main points that we wanted to raise in this On the Pulse conversation. There are a range of tools available, and there's a lot of information on our website that many things are for members only, but quite a lot is also accessible publicly, like the dictionary that Brett mentioned, the 3 laws of biometrics, an explanation around the difference between identification and verification. So obviously, we recommend to use those tools. And with that, I end this conversation, this On the Pulse conversation today, but there are others we're going to have on hot issues, and I really hope that our listeners will find this conversation useful. So thanks again, Brett, for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. A pleasure.